Hi, welcome to the Badaboom podcast. I'm Troy.
And I'm Chris.
And today we are talking about Love and Thunder, the highly anticipated sequel to Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok was great. My favorite MCU movie. I know it's up there for you, man. I thought Love and Thunder was going to be great, and it was. Taika Waititi did it again.
For me, it wasn't great.
What?
But it was good. You know, like you said, Ragnarok is up there for me. But there were some parts of the plot and the pacing, just because it was so short, that it didn't quite live up to Ragnarok. That doesn't mean it's a bad movie, and we've talked about this. I think I'm at like MCU fatigue, where, you know, these movies don't mean anything really to the characters or even the greater MCU. So they don't feel good. I really liked Ragnarok just because of the way it took the character to a different place. Meant a lot personally to him, but also was something different. This one, I think some of the jokes are kind of like are worn out.
Yeah, I think the Mjolnir and Stormbreaker kind of jokes, there's maybe one too many.
One too many. And with me, the amount of times he refers to himself as a space Viking just reminds me of like when they make fun of the fact that Spider-Man is called Spider-Man and has what it's just like.
Yeah,
I think and this is just a problem with all Marvel movies. I think before, like when MCU first started, they did such a they had to work so hard to make these things believable and make people believe in it. Now it's gotten to the point where it's so like self-referential, and that they can't even it's like, we get it. Yes, he is a space Viking. I don't need to hear that every like, this is the fourth movie. I get it. I believe it already. But, you know, despite those complaints, I thought, you know, there's some really like intimate moments. We get to see Jane and Thor in their relationship. I think that's part of like, you know, some of my favorite parts. The opening with the Guardians of the Galaxy is some of my favorite like Marvel stuff, period. But, you know, I definitely think it is no Ragnarok.
it's not. And I think one reason for me that really pulled it back from being able to reach the levels of Ragnarok is, and I'm going to say this just because I do music, is the music. Like, there was a lot of Guns N' Roses music in this, and it kind of felt at sometimes just like a giant Guns N' Roses music video. And the music in Ragnarok really like brought me more into the plot, whereas the music in this one kind of like pulled me out of it a little bit. So there were some funny parts that like they really were digging into the Guns N' Roses stuff, and it was funny. And the fight scene with November Rain was cool, but overall, like that's definitely something that like kept it, I think, from like being as good as Ragnarok was. It's just too much Guns N' Roses.
Not just too much Guns N' Roses, just too many needle drops, you know. Again, it just, at a certain point, it had taken what was great about Ragnarok and like does what sequel do. They just continue to do it, but more and bigger. And I think in this instance, being that Ragnarok really was a comedy sequels are never great. It's good. You know, I love the direction they've taken Thor, just because I didn't find him interesting before Ragnarok. But, you know, I do get some, you know, why some people are upset that, you know, he's been turned into a joke, because in an instance like this, where you have a very serious villain like Christian Bale's Gore the God Butcher, it's hard to contrast that with, you know, like that kind of villain doesn't really belong in a comedy.
Yeah, he's so dark, and there needed to be a tone of seriousness with it, which I do think they've developed throughout the movie, especially as Thor was realizing Jane was dying. I think it could have maybe been a little bit more serious, or like emphasized how serious he was. But like the ending scene where he's like kind of like telling Jane she has to stay in bed. It's like, all right, cool. We're at a good spot for some seriousness. And like, the thing was, though, that was like the climax a little bit of her arc a little bit. And I was thinking, oh no, we're going to have a little bit more coming up soon, and it's going to get even more serious. And then there'll be like a confrontation, but it just kind of like, it hit its peak right there. And I was like, oh yeah, it's definitely a comedy. They're not going to like increase that seriousness or like add more value to it that way.
Yeah, and talking about like Gore, like the way the setup of the movie is, at the very beginning we see Gore, Christian Bale's Gore, on his planet, very close to his origins in the comic book. He's with his daughter. He's praying, for his God to save them. And then his daughter dies, and he does encounter his God in front of the wielder of the Necro Sword. And from that moment, he sees how selfish his God is, although he had given his life and his daughter's life to worshiping them. His prayers were never answered, and he vows to kill all gods. And that's the setup, and that's what brings Thor into it. As he was with the Guardians of the Galaxy, they're running into events where everyone's gods are dying, and there's distress calls all around the galaxy, which seem scary and interesting, but that's immediately like dropped because Gore decides that he has to find eternity to wish that all gods are dead, even though he has no problem killing many gods.
Yeah, but I think they they didn't do the best job of like linking those ideas together, I think. But we see like later on in the movie, he knows he has to get to Thor to open the Bifrost to get to eternity. And this seems like killing these lesser gods was just the entire setup, just to get Thor's attention and then be able to get his hammer or Stormbreaker and then be able to get to eternity to make quick work of it. Because even Zeus later on is like, yeah, dude, they can't get to us. We're totally fine. And Gore probably knew that. He's like, all right, the only way I can get to them is just I gotta get Stormbreaker so then I can take care of all of them in one fell swoop.
Yeah, but in a not to be like, oh, the comics, but like he's a little scarier because he does get to gods like that. He does get to places where you're like, oh my God. And also like when he's, when he decides to go like nuclear, he had fought Thor enough where it felt like, oh my God, this is the only option. Because again, to me, it felt like Gore was having no problem killing any gods. And if the plan all along was to get Thor should have been the first god he killed, or he would have went to New Asgard, messed stuff up, kidnapped the kids. They would have figured out a way to contact Thor, and then he would have got involved somehow.
Yeah, but it's a movie, man. Like
it's a movie, yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like we're trying to like fill in those holes, but the reality, like the more you kind of think about it, the more you're like, well, like at the end when he gets to eternity, and then Thor's like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you can actually like wish your daughter back. And then he's like, oh shit, I can.
Yeah, but I think at that point it was because of the sword had corrupted him so much that maybe that's not what he realized, that's what he could do.
No, I mean, again, that is like a line thrown in like right before he's about to go into eternity. It's like, oh, he's dying. He's being corrupted by the Necro Sword. It's like, I think that kind of diminishes like him as a villain, because it's like, hey, he had a very valid reason to take that vow to say, I'm going to kill all gods. And the Necro Sword, yeah, it enhances some of those feelings and stuff, but like, again, I don't think he's dumb. And he's just like, oh, like the whole thing was his daughter, So I don't know. It felt like, and again, it's because the movie is short too. Some of these things make like leaps. Not that he turned into a good guy, but it almost felt like that scene almost felt like the Martha scene in Batman versus Superman. It was like, wait, you're just trying to kill everyone. And now you're just like, oh yeah, like I'll wish my daughter back and, have a good time.
Yeah, okay. First off, it's definitely more logical than the Martha scene in Batman. Way more logical than that. You cannot get lower than illogical when you're talking about the Martha Batman versus Superman scene. Like, it doesn't make sense. And we can reason enough that this does make sense, that he made this choice. He was dying. He doesn't have the necromancer sword anymore. So he's like, look, if I'm going to die, like, wouldn't it just be easier to like let my daughter be able to live? So like, there's some reasoning you can do for it. But like, the thing is like, good writing means you don't have to do reasoning to a certain extent. And like you said, it's so short. Before we started recording, I was like, dude, it's only like thought it was like 2 hours and 10 minutes. Like, dude, it's only an hour and 45 minutes. I was like, crap. Maybe because I am including the preview time, which is 20 minutes. But yeah, they moved really fast through it. But still, they had some, of course, great jokes, great moments, some great characters in it. I really loved what they did with Valkyrie and bringing her back and giving her a pretty good amount of time, like in the spotlight, and she gets to do those Old Spice commercials, which I thought was hilarious. My favorite line is when she's like, "I'm Team Jane, just like you, Thor." I was like, "Yes, that's comic book accurate."
Yeah, as usual, my favorite part was Korg, and Natalie Portman as the Mighty Thor, or as Jane Foster. It was cool to see her back, but it was like weird to see her like cracking jokes all the time.
Yeah,
Just because she had, she was out of the MCU for a bit, and coming into the world of like the new world of Thor, where it's Taika Waititi's taste and stuff. I would have liked to see her, be portrayed more in like in contrast to Thor, because it felt like they both were just like making the same types of jokes, and you're just like, I guess this is why you guys are a couple, but it doesn't seem like, it seems like you guys get along so well. How would you ever break up?
yeah, I
Uh,
agree. Because I think like in the past they kind of portrayed her as she's a very intellectual person, and she's got no problem telling Thor that's a bad idea. That's kind of stupid. And with her wielding Mjolnir now, it's like, she has the opportunity to kind of show him that she can be an even better Thor than he was, and kind of like becomes a little bit of a competition, which it was at sometimes. But yeah, I think like the jokes kind of made that aspect of it take a backseat.
It was cool though. I liked her, the way they enhanced Mjolnir, kind of made it a little different when it'll break into pieces and come back and
That was
stuff like
cool.
that. And obviously physically she transformed. She's huge in this movie. So is Chris Hemsworth. I'm like, Jesus Christ, like what workout plan were they on? But
She
yeah,
worked out for like 8 months before the movie, like every day.
looks like 8 years.
Dang.
No, but it's a good movie. Like the one refreshing part actually was that it tied so little to the larger MCU that I was able to enjoy it for what it was. And I'm getting to that point where, like maybe I should start enjoying these things for what they are, because the reality is if you build them up too much in your head, that's when you get disappointed.
Yeah, I walked into this movie thinking it's Taika Waititi. It's gonna be jokes. Chris Hemsworth is also like an executive producer on this one, so it's gonna be lots of jokes too. But I didn't really feel like there was gonna be a lot of connection to future MCU projects, really. So I was just in there for a good time. There were some great post-credit scenes that I think like lay out some potential for the future, and we got to see some peppering of celestials to kind of give Eternal some more meaning, I guess. But like, it's a movie for a good time. Like, it's a movie that like if my girlfriend, who doesn't know hardly anything about the MCU unless I tell her what's up, if I take her to it, she'll be like, "Oh yeah, that was a great movie. That was really fun, and that was an action packed and stuff." I'm like, "Yeah, that's what I think Thor kind of is. Like, he's around forever, so he doesn't have to be taken seriously for every single movie."
That's true. That's true. Sure. Again, Ragnarok was, it trades places as my number one MCU movie. So it was hard to live up to that. The expectations were less about the larger MCU and the way it kind of ranked up to Ragnarok and also other Taika projects, because I love What We Do in the Shadows, one of my favorite movies, also one of my favorite shows on TV. So it definitely was built up, and kind of following up on the post credits too. I don't know, these post credit scenes, these last few movies have felt like very like, I don't know where this leads. It makes little to no sense to me. I mean, obviously we've talked about spoilers the whole time, but Jane going to Valhalla, you're like, oh, like that's, a nod to the comics, and seeing, Hamdale eventually probably becoming a Valkyrie will be something cool to explore in future Thor movies. I would have liked to see, some setup for, Guardians 3, being that they had such a cool role at the beginning. It's just, I don't know what any of these things are setting up, and part of the MCU and the lore of it, it's like you go watch the next one because you're like, oh, they're gonna address something. A lot of the post-credit scenes that have been happening the last few projects, it almost feels like they can very easily ignore.
Yeah, I don't know about ignore. I think they're mostly just trying to introduce new characters, mostly through these post-credit scenes, so that you can feel better about going and seeing a movie about someone that hasn't ever had one before, or you can feel a little bit more invested into a storyline that doesn't really seem that familiar. Of course, all the spoiler alerts, but like having Hercules show up at the end of it and him going to Earth, it's like, okay, now we've got a threat that's going to come to Earth for the future. We don't know where it's going to show up, and we don't know who's going to be there to defend it. So whenever that threat kind of pops up in the future,
Is it a threat though? Hercules.
Yeah.
I don't know. Some people from the that are fans of Thor comics were like, "Oh, Hercules is coming." It's like I really don't like, in a world of Infinity Stones and Kangs and Lokis. Am I really like that? Like excited to see Hercules?
Hey, I'm excited because I love that Roy from Ted Lasso is playing Hercules. I was like, man, that's an excellent choice. But it's more excited for, like, hey, let's see this dynamic and like the comedy and whatnot on the screen. Let's see that more so than, hey, I'm excited for what this means to the overall MCU. I'm excited because I think it's gonna be a good time. Not necessarily excited for like, hey, this is gonna be a great story and everything like that. I agree. Like you could forget these scenes. And that was kind of me trying to defend it, but you're also right at the same time.
Yeah. Now that you bring it up, another beef I kind of had was like, no one really died in a movie about, Gord the God Butcher. He really killed only one god on screen.
Yeah.
And Thor kind of killed more, like, he kind of killed more gods than him. But again, no one died. So Zeus was alive in the end. When you thought Korg was about to die, you're like, oh my God, like this is going to be really sad. And it's like, oh, he's alive. And then when Valkyrie gets stabbed through the chest, you're like, oh my God, she's going to die. She didn't die. And then Jane, she dies. And then they go to Valhalla and you're like, oh, she didn't really die. So I don't know. It just took all the emotional stakes out of the movie for me, because they had pulled that trick like so many times during the same movie. It's almost like the last season of Titans, where everyone seems to have gotten shot in the chest, but they they live. I just hate when like that is repeated in the same story, where someone's like, oh, they're dead. No, they're not. Oh, they're dead. No, they're not.
Yeah, and I think maybe because it is such a short movie, they were like, oh yeah, we can't really have too many people die because we haven't introduced a lot of characters that could die. But we'll have to see who can actually die in the future MCU. Chris Hemsworth is down to play Thor for as long as needed. So I don't know if it'll be him in the end to pass up the mantle anytime soon. But he has a new sidekick, which I love how they tied in the title of, like, they call them Love and Thunder. I was like, man, that's a great way for ending this movie. And overall, I thought it was a pretty good movie. We both know it's not as great as Ragnarok. It's got some faults, but I still think it's a pretty good movie.
Yeah, it's fun. I think some of these movies do need a little more time.
Yeah.
I think between Ragnarok, and they should have given the movie, and from what I heard, they cut a lot out. Not that I want to see like a director's cut, but I think it would have done a lot to enhance Gord the God Butcher as a villain, and also Jane's journey, because Thor at this point, I think after Ragnarok, it's hard for his character to go anywhere. But I'd be lying to say if I didn't have a good time watching it.
Yeah. Well, and you can keep having a good time by listening to the Badaboom podcast. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. Hit that subscribe button and tell us what you thought about Love and Thunder. Join the conversation. We're on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and recently have launched our YouTube channel. So get in the comments, let us know your thoughts. What was your favorite part about the movie? And until next time, bada boom.
Bada boom.